Hello. The nights are getting longer, and the evenings are getting colder with every night that passes. So I thought I would do you a story of Old Winter. Now on this occasion, Old Winter is not actually the season itself, but the name of a man from the mid to late 1700s, who supposedly, at least according to popular belief at the time, lived in Ipswich in Suffolk. Old Winter, who is also sometimes referred to as Dr. Winter, although he doesn't appear to have been a medical doctor. In this case, doctor is a term of praise, an appellation for people who were considered particularly wise or particularly clever, was a cunning man, a wise man indeed, who supposedly lived in Ipswich and is referred to in various 19th century books. He engaged in magical acts, spellcraft, that sort of thing, breaking curses that were laid on people, finding suspected villains, thieves, crooks on a small-scale basis. And I was so taken by the idea of Old Winter when I came across him that I actually included him in my short story collection, A Dangerous Place. The story appearing in here is not the one which I will recite to you now. The story appearing here is one I made up entirely. Whereas the one I'm about to tell you is a traditional story of Old Winter, accounted for on one of these 19th century texts. If you like the story, buy the book, find out more about Old Winter. It has some details of his life and history, as well as the actual story itself. One cold October night, Old Winter was returning through the streets of Ipswich. He had just passed the church of St Mary at Quay when the bubbling vapours of the swamp waters, the marsh waters, emanated out through the crypts into the cold fresh air and turned his nose upwards. The old man, gaunt and thin, hurried along the streets, hurried through the poor tenement houses either side, and up past those tenements, up to the individual cottages further out of Ipswich. And there he spotted, by moonlight, a figure up to something very strange in one of the gardens. He paused a while, still and silent as a tree in the moonlight, watching the comings and goings of this strange, scruffy-looking man in the garden. A garden which Old Winter knew perfectly well did not belong to the man that was in it, for he knew nearly all of his neighbours along that road. At length the man in the garden realised he was being watched and spun round. "Oi, Grandad, what are you looking at?" he demanded. Old Winter peered closely at him. "Why are you taking cabbages from the widow's garden?" The thief was taken aback. "What's it to do with you?" "They are not your cabbages," said the old wizard. "You are robbing a woman who can ill afford to lose food. She has 4 children to feed." "What do I care?" said the thief. "If you care so much for cabbages," and here he picked up his walking stick, inscribed with strange and ancient symbols, and pointed it straight at that man. "If you care so much for cabbages, hold them." And muttering something strange under his breath, the old wizard turned and wandered back along the street, back towards his home. The thief in the garden watched him go and tried to turn round to take the next cabbage, but couldn't. He tried to put down the cabbages he was holding, but couldn't. Not only were his feet seemingly frozen to the ground, but his arms were frozen in the act of holding the cabbages he had already stolen, and try as he might, he could not unclench his muscles. Neither his arms, nor his legs, nor even the muscles in his neck to turn his head, not even the muscles in his jaw to call for help. He was frozen stiff. All he could do was stand and shiver and listen to the distant crunching of footsteps as the wizard got further and further and further away from him and closer and closer and closer towards his own home. But Old Winter's adventures of the night were not yet over, for he had not gone another 200 yards when another figure caught his eye in another garden. And looking and watching, again as still as a tree, as still as a tombstone, watching and observing, he saw a young lad, perhaps 17, 18 years old, piling branch after branch, log after log, into his arms, robbing an old man's wood supply for the winter, ready to take back to his own house to burn on his own fire. And as soon as that young man turned around with a great big haul of logs in his arms, he stopped dead to realise that strange bony old scarecrow that had suddenly appeared in the street wasn't a scarecrow at all, but was one of the locals watching him. "What are you doing?" said Old Winter. "Really, you intend to rob an old man of his only source of heat, his only source of fire, in weather like this? Have you no shame, boy?" "Mind your own business," bellowed the young man. "It's my wood, it's nothing to do with you. Get on your way, you old fool, or I'll make it the worse for you." "Oh, will you?" said Old Winter. "Will you indeed make it the worse for me? Well, if you like carrying wood so much, you carry it, and you carry it, and you carry it." And again he pointed his staff, his walking stick, at that young man and muttered an imprecation under his breath before continuing the short journey to his own home. And that young man watched the old gentleman passing on his way in his strange, tattered, patched-up old garb, the kind of thing his grandfather had worn when he was young. And he made to put down the wood he was carrying in order to get himself another load. But he could not. And try as he might to put it down, his arms would just not relax. And not only did his arms appear to have a life of their own, but his feet seemed to have a life of their own too, for they began to walk round and round and round the cottage whose woodpile he had been stealing from. And as much as he tried to walk up the path to go towards his own home down by the docks, his feet had a mind of their own and continued to go round and round and round and round. And as much as he tried to call for help, his jaw was clamped shut. Well, come the morning, when Old Winter awoke from sleeping the sleep of the just, he found on his doorstep 2 big plump cabbages and 3 big thick logs placed there by his grateful neighbours. And word came to him later that day that when the constable had been making his morning rounds, he had discovered, frozen stiff, near dead from frostbite, one of the local hooligans stood in the old widow's garden, still clutching the stolen cabbages, shivering and shaking and nearly blue with frostbite. And as soon as the constable had placed his firm grip upon that miscreant's shoulder, the man had relaxed and dropped his cabbages hither and yon, and the old widow who lived in the cottage, when she opened the door and saw what was going on near, died of fright. But she knew, as the constable knew, that there was but one man who could have done what he had done to the thief. And whilst the constable was trying to arrest the first purloiner of other people's goods, there came a shout from up the road from an elderly man saying, "There is somebody in my garden," summoning, calling for help. And the constable and a couple of the neighbouring lads marched up the street, and there they found, half dead with exhaustion, shivering and shaking with cold, sweat dripping from his face despite the cold weather, still carrying that great pile of logs and going round and round and round, his feet blistered and bleeding from having spent 3 solid hours going round and round and round the hooligan in question. And so, as they were carted away by the constable, the neighbours expressed their gratitude to the Wizard of Ipswich.